We're going to check out the Satanic Verses here. Used to be one of my favorite 2 or 3 topics when I was getting started, like back in 2005, 2006, 2007, and so, well, even before that. Ran with this for a long time. I think it's one of the most terrible problems for Muhammad's claim to be a prophet. And so ran with this for a while. Then I pulled back. Then I pulled back on it a lot because I read the doctoral dissertation of a man named Shahab Ahmed, who became a Harvard scholar of Islamic studies, and his doctoral dissertation was on the Satanic Verses, and he included in his dissertation 37 Muslim sources for the Satanic Verses story. And almost no one had any clue that there was that much evidence for the Satanic Verses. Anyway, then he announced on his page that he was eventually going to publish a book on the historical evidence for the Satanic Verses. And keep in mind, this was in the sort of early days of people publicly posting criticisms of Islam on YouTube and so on. And I didn't want Muslims warning him not to publish this stuff, right? I don't want Muslims threatening him, saying, do not publish that. You're giving tons of ammunition to the kuffar and so on. So I'm like, oh, okay, I won't use this much. I'll just use it sparingly, give a simple little version of the argument here and there, maybe for debates and so on. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and leave it alone for a while until that book comes out. Well, he actually, he died several years ago, but he had the book published posthumously. So he published it after, he waited until after his death for the book to come out. Smart. But by that time, I was focusing on other arguments like the Islamic dilemma and so on, so I never got back to it. But just so you know, spoiler alert, this is the year of the Islamic dilemma. And next year, we'll have the year of the Satanic Verses and of taking out their argument from Muhammad in the Bible. So as far as getting everyone well equipped and so on. So the Satanic Verses, you may have heard of Salman Rushdie's book on the Satanic Verses. His book isn't about really about the historical event of the Satanic Verses. It's just kind of making fun of the situation and just bringing up that sore spot for Muslims enough to get him a fatwa calling for his death. And he's had to remain in hiding a long time just for basically mentioning the Satanic Verses and getting attention to it. So, as far as if you're not familiar with what the actual story of the Satanic Verses are, it's the story of a man doing the most embarrassing thing he could ever possibly do. I don't know if you guys have ever said something that you wish you could take back. I have. Matter of fact, it's kind of a stupid example, but this was right after I got out of prison. So this is like a few months after I got out of prison in 2000. I was going to church and so on. And you would go to the church service, and then you'd have go to a Bible study afterwards. And I was in the Bible study, and I heard a pastor come in, and he asked a paramedic, but the paramedic was old by this time. But he said, "Hey, you're a paramedic. Do you know like a fireman or something like that? Do you know someone who can lift over 200 pounds?" And I'm sitting there. I'm right out of prison, very strong. So I said, "Hey, I'm your guy. I can lift over 200 pounds." Thought they needed something, just like something carried down the stairs or something like that. Well, they did, but not what I was expecting. So I said, "Hey, I can lift 200 pounds." And the guy said, "Oh, great. Then you have to be here tonight at the baptism service." And the situation was, there was a woman who was paralyzed on one side of her body because of a stroke, and she'd had a leg amputated. And the baptism tank was at the bottom of the winding staircase. And they could have baptized her somewhere else, but they wanted to baptize her in the same spot with everyone else. And so they needed someone to carry her down this winding staircase into the baptism tank and so on. So anyway, they told me to meet her at the door of the church when she got there and so on. So I'm there waiting at the door of the church, and it was her and her daughter. Her daughter was an adult. And I start pushing the wheelchair in the direction we're supposed to go, and I'm wheeling her through the church. Her daughter's walking with me. And eventually I run over someone's foot. I run over a guy's foot, happened to be that same paramedic. So I run over his foot with the wheelchair, and he says, "Hey, you just ran over my foot." And without thinking, I blurted out, "Quit whining, you got another one." You see the problem, right? So it's a woman with one leg, and I tell this guy he's got another one, right? And I turn to her daughter, who's like looking at me like, "This is the guy who's going to carry me." So anyway, got the baptism done and stuff like that, but I wish that I did not say that at that time. It turns out it was a 3-foot problem. She was missing a foot. I ran over someone's foot, and my foot was in my mouth, and so it's kind of a 3-foot problem. Anyway, the point of that was sometimes we say things that really wish we could take back, and you just can't. The damage has been done. So I have an idea of how Muhammad must have felt when he delivered the infamous Satanic Verses. So the idea here is that when Muhammad was preaching in Mecca, he didn't win a ton of converts. The mass conversions came later on. But when Muhammad's preaching in Mecca, did not win a ton of converts, and the Muslim community is being persecuted and so on. And Muhammad was longing for a revelation that would help win his tribe to him. And he really wanted his tribe to join him so that he could have help in conquering Arabia. That was already part of the plan back then. So he was longing for a revelation that would help his people convert to Islam. And eventually he got the revelation that he was looking for. These words were originally part of Surah 53 of the Qur'an. You get to a part that mentions Allat, Alus, and Manat. Here's what it says. "Have you not heard of Allat and Alusa and Manat, the third, the other? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for." Allat, Alus, and Manat were 3 pagan goddesses. And the idea here is these are the exalted cranes, meaning they thought of intercessors as these like bird goddesses. So the idea is that, yes, Allah is the main God, but it's okay to pray to pagan goddesses because they're your intercessors. They will carry your prayers up to Allah. You're familiar with the sources. When Allah wants to hear your prayers, he has to travel down and get close and to listen to your prayers. Well, why not pray to these pagan goddesses and they just carry your prayers up to Allah, and Allah doesn't have to do so much traveling. So Muhammad eventually got this revelation. He delivered this revelation to his followers, and he bowed down in honor of the revelation. Then his followers bowed down in honor of the revelation, and then the polytheists also bowed down. They were overjoyed that Muhammad had spoken favorably of their goddesses. But a little later, he comes back and says, "Sorry, the devil made me do it. The devil tricked me into delivering these revelations." And so he came back, and then Surah 53 does not say this. It says something different now. But this is what Surah 53 originally said. So Satan tricked him into promoting polytheism. Muslims today almost universally reject the story of the Satanic Verses. Interestingly, it's because of a theological shift that happened in the early centuries of Islam. But in the early centuries of Islam, this was just taken for granted. This was known to be true. And later on, they changed their theology, and after they changed their theology, then they rule out the story as something that couldn't have happened. It's too embarrassing for them. So the question is, did it really happen? Your average Muslim today would believe that the story was made up. And again, people don't realize how much evidence there is for this. So if we want to know if something happened, let's say in 7th century Arabia, there are 2 main methodologies we could use. One, we've got the historical method. This is the method that historians use. And second, we can apply the method that Muslims use when they investigate Islamic history. So this is isnad criticism. We'll actually apply both and see where they go. But I don't know if you saw Sheikh Yasser Qadhi's recent admission. He said that hadith methodology cannot stand up to academic scrutiny. He said no one in the academic world takes hadith methodology seriously. And he ended up saying, so it's basically when I'm in the academic world, I can't take it seriously. When I'm Sheikh Yasser Qadhi speaking in the mosque, then I'll take it seriously as a good Muslim. In other words, he was saying, we just have to accept this by blind faith as Muslims, but we have no real reason to think that this methodology is grand. But we'll go ahead and use both methodologies here. So when we're talking about the historical method, in other words, how a historian would approach this, for something like this, historians would be looking for a couple of things. One, they'd be looking to see if there is early testimony. If your information is from many centuries later, that gives a lot of time to invent things and so on. So how early is the material? Generally, not always, but generally, the earlier the better, as far as historians are concerned. And when we apply that, we find that the Satanic Verses are reported in our earliest biographical records. In fact, it's all over the place in our earliest records. So this isn't something that was invented centuries after the time of Muhammad. This goes back to the 1st century of Islam. The next thing historians would be looking for, multiple sources. So if you just have one source, well, it may be true, and if it's a very trustworthy person, you might trust the testimony of just one person. But in general, the more sources, the merrier. Like if you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sources or something like that, then that's stronger from a historical perspective. So in other words, if you think one person may have made something up, well, what happened with these other guys? Why are a bunch of witnesses saying this sort of thing? Now, when we're talking about the Satanic Verses, our historical records of the Satanic Verses, we're not talking about one source or 2 sources or 5 sources or 10 sources or 20 sources even. Shahab Ahmed, in his doctoral dissertation again, he had 37 sources on the Satanic Verses. By the time his book was published after his death, he had 50 Muslim sources on the Satanic Verses. And so we have dozens of reports. If we went from 37 to 50 in a period of several years, probably some out there that he didn't even include, but there's a lot of sources, especially if you're a Muslim and you think people made these up. So it's not just some guy made them, a bunch of people had to make something up and collaborate and work together and put this story out there. And one more thing historians would look for, is independent sources. So I mentioned if you could have a bunch of sources. So the question is, let's suppose you have 10 sources. If you have 10 sources, but they're all simply quoting the same person, it's not really 10 sources, that's one source. In other words, if one person is a source and he tells 10 people, and then those 10 people go out and tell the story, that's not 10 independent sources. That's one independent source and then a bunch of people sharing it. And fortunately, this is where isnad criticism actually helps, because they're telling where they got this story from. They're keeping records of where they're getting these things from. And so even if you want to agree with Sheikh Yasser Qadhi that it's a sloppy system and not a great system, they are tracing things back to different individuals who were sharing this story and giving different versions of the story. So we know we've got some independent sources here. And let me just go through where this information is coming from. So of the 50 sources that were included in Shahab Ahmed's book, 7 go back to Ka'b al-Kharazi, one of Islam's great early Qur'an scholars. 6 go back to Urwa ibn al-Zubair, early Meccan scholar who's known as the founder of the study of the life of Muhammad. He was also Aisha's nephew, Abu Bakr's grandson, and the son of Abu Bakr's daughter, Asma, who was one of the first 20 converts to Islam. 5 go back to Abu Aliya al-Basri, another of the greatest Quran scholars of the 1st century of Islam. He studied the Quran with Caliph Umar, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. 2 go back to al-Sudi, another early scholar who studied with Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas is Muhammad's cousin. 3 reports go back to Qatada ibn Diyama, one of Islam's greatest early Quran commentators. 2 go back to Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Harith, one of the top scholars of Islamic law during the 1st century of Islam. One comes from the tafsir of Ibn al-Sa'ib al-Kalbi, an early commentator who composed the longest tafsir, commentary on the Qur'an, that had been written up until his time. One goes back to al-Dahak ibn Muzahim al-Balki, a first century expert in tafsir. 4 go back to Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, an early Quran scholar who wrote the earliest surviving complete tafsir of the Quran. 3 go back to Mujahid ibn Jabr, who was a student of Ibn Abbas and was called during his lifetime the most learned man alive in tafsir. 1 goes back to Ikrimah, a slave of Ibn Abbas and an expert on the life of Muhammad. We have 10 reports that go back to Muhammad's cousin Ibn Abbas himself, the founder of Quranic studies. We have 3 that go back to Sa'id ibn Jubair, one of the leading Quranic scholars of his time and one of the top students of Ibn Abbas. Some of Ibn Abbas's narratives go through Sa'id ibn Jubair, but some of them are from Sa'id ibn Jubair himself. And we have 2 that go back to al-Hasan al-Basri, an early scholar of the Quran and of Sharia. So some of these aren't completely independent because you have Ibn Abbas and he has students and so on, and they're getting their, they're studying with him and with others and so on. So there are interconnections among a lot of these guys. But when we trace back to the origin of various versions of the story, we get a list of these guys. And so we have independent sources. Some of them are connected, and some of them are just completely different people. So it's clear that we have numerous independent sources for the Satanic Verses. Now, we've just looked at the 3 main criteria that a historian would use in evaluating the Satanic Verses. We have early sources going back to the 1st century of Islam. We have multiple sources, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50, and we have independent sources, including a number of Islam's best 1st century historians and commentators. But we can go even further. Historians also apply principles such as the principle of embarrassment. The principle of embarrassment states that, as a general rule, dedicated followers of some religion or religious tradition aren't going to invent embarrassing material that hurts the case that they're trying to make or that would cause people to doubt their religion. If you're going to invent something, you'd invent something positive, something that helps you, like a miracle story or something like that. But you're not going to invent a story that actually hurts your case or makes your scholar or your religious hero or something like that look bad or stupid or deceptive or something like that. And this isn't just something that we would apply here. This is used not just by historians. This would be used in courts of law and so on, and just in general conversations or something. People tend to, if you're going to make something up, people tend to make up positive things and not things that would make them look bad. So, in other words, if we were sitting here and you came up and accused me of something, you say, "Hey, David, did you steal my sandwich?" Suppose you thought your sandwich is there and your sandwich disappeared. Wondering, "Hey, what's going on? Where'd that sandwich go?" I think David stole it. Say, "David, did you steal my sandwich?" Suppose my response is, "No, I was over at the school selling crack to kids." You're probably going to think, "Well, okay, I don't think he stole my sandwich, because why would he make that up?" If I'd said, "No, I was over at the nursing home volunteering to help people," and then, okay, that sounds like you're making that up. So anyway, point is, people tend to make up positive things, and so it's always possible that you're making up something negative. It's possible that you have a reason, maybe we're not familiar with it. So if it's like one thing that's being made up and you can't think of a good reason, it looks embarrassing, you have to be careful. Someone may have made up something that's embarrassing and they didn't think it was embarrassing. We know this story was embarrassing to them. It was very embarrassing. They kept watering down the story over time and changing details to make Muhammad not look as bad and so on. So this was a huge embarrassment. But to their credit, they kept reporting on it, even if they were changing details and so on to make Muhammad not look so bad. So we know this was embarrassing to them, and because it's a ton of sources, if you wanted to say they made it up, it's a situation, okay, Ibn Abbas and why are all these guys simultaneously making up a story about Muhammad receiving a revelation and being duped by Satan? Why would people make up a story about Muhammad not being able to tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan? I mean, for me, that would call the entire religion into question. Why would you make that up? So until some good explanation of why they would make all of this up arises, really looks like this is something that happened. And so we have the great Oxford scholar Guillaume. So if you've heard of it, the English translation of Ibn Asaq, that's Guillaume is the one who translated that. But he says, it is impossible to suggest a motive that would induce the early Muslims to write such a story about the prophet unless it were true. If historical evidence is to be given any value, we must hold that Muhammad pronounced these words in the middle of Surah 53. In other words, if we're going to take history seriously at all, and where we're dealing with piles of sources and the earliest material, and it's extremely embarrassing, if this doesn't qualify as something we know historically, fine, just don't ever bring up history because there's nothing we can know. And Montgomery Watt concludes, Muhammad must have publicly recited the Satanic Verses as part of the Qur'an. It is unthinkable that the story could have been invented by Muslims or foisted upon them by non-Muslims. So if you're going to say, no, someone must have made this up, someone made up this story. Okay, who? Muslims or non-Muslims? If it's Muslims, why are a bunch of Muslims getting together and making up a story about their prophet being tricked by Satan? Why would they make that up? Or if you're saying non-Muslims invented this story, okay, if a bunch of non-Muslims come up to Muhammad's companions and so on and say, hey, did you know your prophet delivered a revelation from the devil? Why are the Muslims going to accept that and pass that on? If it didn't happen, they'd be going, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? His companions were there during this time. We didn't see this. What are you talking about? So the best by far explanation for why we have so much information on this coming from Muslims themselves is, like it or not, it happened, and they recorded it early on. Now, at this point, Muslims usually say, well, history schmistery, we looked at the isnads and we don't like them, which means we are going to reject the story regardless of how much evidence there is for it from the perspective of a historian. If you're not familiar with the Muslim method of historical investigation, Muslims have stories about Muhammad, and those stories come with a list of names. I got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, and ideally you would trace it back to a companion of Muhammad. So a Muslim scholar looks at these names, and if he likes everyone on the list, he says, everyone on the list of this chain of transmission is a reliable Muslim who can be trusted, then he'll like the story, unless he has some other reason to not like the story. If a Muslim scholar doesn't like the names on the list, he can reject the story or consider it weak. And this is the standard Muslim excuse for rejecting all kinds of historical facts about Muhammad. But it's based on a misunderstanding of the proper application of isnad criticism. So the isnad is the list of names. In the early centuries of Islam, there were two broad categories of historical literature. So they were sort of doing and writing history in two different ways. On the one hand, there was the hadith literature. First it was oral transmission, and then they start writing things down. And on the other hand, there was the Sirah Maghazi literature. So this is like biographical material. The hadith literature consisted of sayings and deeds that defined Muslim doctrine and practice. So they're telling a story that's telling you about how you're supposed to live or something that you're supposed to believe or something like that. The Sirah Maghazi literature was more just straightforward historical narratives. They're trying to describe the life of Muhammad. They're trying to give details about the life of Muhammad. So the main emphasis wasn't on here's something that you need for doctrine or here's something that you need for your Muslim practice. The emphasis was on providing a biography of Muhammad and his companions and so on. So we have two different kinds of historical methodologies. The hadith scholars insisted on having complete isnads that go all the way back to a companion of Muhammad. The Sirah Maghazi scholars often gave abbreviated isnad. They still sometimes gave chains of transmission. Sometimes they didn't give chains of transmission, but it was much more acceptable in the Sirah Maghazi literature to just trace it back to someone you can trust. You could just trace a story back to someone in the first century of Islam that you trust and who was known for not making things up. But they didn't insist on going all the way back to a companion of Muhammad. So the two different categories of historical reports that we have, they're doing different things and they have different methodologies. And so Muslims who reject the Satanic Verses based on hadith methodology are just confused about the role of isnads in the Sirah Maghazi literature. In other words, if you're taking hadith methodology and you're going to the Sirah Maghazi literature and you're saying, hey, this doesn't match up to our criteria, right, it's a different kind, it's a different system. So reports of the Satanic Verses were accepted by the greatest of the Sirah scholars, Ibn Abi Hatim, Ibn al-Mundar, Ibn Mardawayh, Musa ibn Uqba, Abu Mashar, Ibn Asaq, al-Tabari. It's all over the place among the Sirah guys. But think about it. What kind of story is the Satanic Verses? It's not about, hey, here's our theology. It's not about, hey, here's our Islamic practice. It's not telling you, hey, here's how you receive a revelation from Satan or something like that. It's describing something that happened. So it's in the category of the Sirah literature, not in the hadith literature. So if we judge the stories based on the type of literature they're actually contained in, the reports turned out to be as solid as anything I can think of in the Sirah literature. But just for fun, let's go ahead and apply the standards of the hadith scholars to the Satanic Verses. So here's an isnad that goes from Ibn Mardawayh all the way back to Ibn Abbas, a companion of Muhammad. And so you've got that's the chain there. Notice it goes all the way to Ibn Abbas at the end. So I got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, all the way back to Ibn Abbas. So that's a chain. So what excuse do Muslims have for rejecting this? Well, everyone on this list is reliable, but there's one person that people just don't know much about. They don't have a lot of information on Muhammad ibn Ali here. So we don't have any reason not to trust him, but Muslims are kind of looking for any excuse to reject this chain. So since we don't have a lot of records about this guy, they would say, we can conclude that we can't trust the story that came from him. It's an interesting way of doing history, but let's look at another one. So here's another isnad chain, again, going all the way back to Ibn Abbas. But what's wrong with this chain? Everyone in this chain is reliable. And you've got the connection going all the way back to a companion of Muhammad. But one of the scribes who transmitted the story said he had doubts. He had doubts about whether this story was true. And so if you were ever to bring this up to a scholar, your average Muslim is going to have no clue what you're talking about here if you bring this up. But if a Muslim scholar who studies this issue, if you were to bring this up, he would say, but one of the scribes who transmitted it said it's unreliable. He didn't say it was unreliable because of anyone on the list. He thought it was unreliable because it's about Muhammad receiving a revelation from the devil. And so just think about that, right? It meets the criteria of the hadith scholars here, but they'll just say, well, this is too embarrassing. A scribe said this is too embarrassing to actually be true. And then Muslims today will use that. You see, this story can't be true. Well, it meets your criteria. You're just saying you don't like it at this point. So anyway, when we bring up the Sirah Maghazi sources, it's, these don't meet the requirements of hadith criticism. We say, well, it's a different kind of literature. But even if you want to go with your standards, you do have sources that meet your requirements. And they say, well, the scribe didn't like the story. Yeah, I wouldn't like the story if I was the scribe either. That doesn't change the fact that it meets all the requirements of different methodologies for a true story. But there are some other sources we need to consider. We have multiple sahih mursal reports. So sahih mursal reports it's sahih, you have a sound chain, but it doesn't go all the way back to a companion of Muhammad. In other words, it doesn't go back to someone who's walking around with Muhammad, but it's a reliable chain going from someone in, let's say, the 2nd or 3rd century back to someone in the 1st century, but not a companion of Muhammad. Various Muslim scholars, including Ibn Taymiyyah, came up with ways of using sahih mursal reports. In other words, it goes back not to a companion, but to someone else. And it was pointed out by Ibn, if you're not familiar with Ibn Taymiyyah, sort of the granddaddy of Salafis and so on, but a very respected Muslim scholar. But he pointed out that if you have multiple sahih mursal chains that go back to multiple individuals, it really looks like it's a true story. Because if you're tracing it back to important figures in the first century of Islam, and you know it goes back to these guys, these important figures, then even if you can't trace it all the way back to a companion, what are the odds that all these different guys independently made up the same story? Pointing out that the best explanation for having all these guys, early guys, say this is that it was understood in the Muslim community. It was known to be true. That's the best explanation for why you'd have that. So he believed that you could take sahih mursal reports and actually apply a methodology to them and come out with the idea that these are true stories. So we have two sahih mursal chains that go back to Sa'id ibn Jubair, who again was one of the top students of Ibn Abbas. We have two sahih mursal chains that go back to Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Harith, one of Islam's greatest first century scholars. And we have four sahih mursal chains that go back to Abu Aliya al-Basri, who again studied with Caliph Umar, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. Since the chains are reliable going back to these individuals, very strange for Muslims to say, well, the companion isn't listed in the isnad, therefore the story is false. You got to be careful with that. If three of your greatest early scholars are teaching independently that Muhammad delivered the Satanic Verses, were they lying? Did they all just make it up? The story didn't exist before them. They just independently decided to make up a story about Muhammad delivering a revelation from the devil. If you say, yes, I believe that's what happened. They all independently decided to make up a story about Muhammad delivering a revelation from Satan. Well, what you're really telling me is that your first century scholars can't be trusted. If they're making up stuff like this, what else are they making up? In other words, if you're saying, hey, our first century scholars were the biggest bunch of liars who ever walked the planet, they'd even make up embarrassing material about Muhammad. Well, if they're inventing embarrassing material about Muhammad, well, why would we trust the positive material about Muhammad? Much more likely to make that sort of thing up. And so, you've got a problem here. If you're saying your first century guys are unreliable, guess what? All the information we know about Muhammad came through the first century guys. So if the first century guys can't be trusted, why would we trust the second century guys or the third century guys and so on? How can we trust any of the Muslim sources if the first century guys were a big bunch of liars? But there's an even bigger problem here if you reject the Satanic Verses. According, again, to Ibn Taymiyyah, if we have multiple sahih mursal reports of an event, we have to accept the event because there's no way several different Muslims would have invented the same false story. So according to, again, the granddaddy of Salafis, this is solid just based on the sahih mursal reports. So when you combine that with the sound isnad chains that go back to a companion of Muhammad and the volume of sources that we have, how in the name of common sense are you saying, nope, someone just made this up? Again, Muslims, why would they do this and why would they be working together and independently coming up with this story? If it's some random person, do you think that person would have walked out of there with his head? If he just walks into the Muslim community and says, yep, your prophet delivered a revelation from the devil. I have my own testimony to back me up, but you guys never heard of it. You think that guy's even going to live? Even if they let him live, you think they're all going to, oh, let's take this story from this kafir who says our prophet delivered a revelation from the devil. There's no explanation here that makes the slightest bit of sense, except it actually happened. So you put it all together, the story meets the requirements of the historical method. We have early sources, we have multiple sources, we have independent sources, and lots of them. It's confirmed by the Sirah Maghazi standards. All the major Sirah Maghazi scholars in early Islam confirmed this story. And even if you want to adopt the joke of a methodology, according to Sheikh Yasser Qadi, it still meets the requirements. At the end of the day, it's just we don't like it, so we're just going to come up with excuses not to believe it. And you kind of can't make you can lay out all the evidence. You can't make a Muslim agree that this story actually happened, but I've seen Muslims actually go through the evidence and they're like, oh, yeah, I didn't think there was this much evidence for it, but yeah. And that's when they start trying to explain how this isn't a problem for Muhammad. But it is. It's a really big problem for Muhammad. And here's one reason why. So Deuteronomy 18:20, I love this specifically because it's 2 verses after their main prophecy about Muhammad in the Old Testament. So Surah 18, verse 18, they quote that. That's where God says he's going to send a prophet like Moses, and they say, see, that's Muhammad. Muhammad is the prophet like Moses. Deuteronomy 18:18 is a prophecy about Muhammad. Go 2 verses later. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. So if you are promoting polytheism, belief in other gods, you would have to die. You were a false prophet. And if you delivered a revelation that did not come from God, and you said it's from God, you were a false prophet, you had to die. So Muslims, it's going to be hard to reject Deuteronomy 18:20 if you're quoting Deuteronomy 18:18 as your main proof that Muhammad is prophesied in the Bible. It's also, because of the Islamic dilemma, very hard to reject Deuteronomy at all, because the Qur'an affirms the inspiration, the preservation, and the authority of the Torah that was in the possession of the Jews during the time of Muhammad. So it's as good as gold there. But look at this. We have 2 criteria of a false prophet. Speak in the name of other gods, or if you deliver a message and it doesn't actually come from God and you say it's from God, you're a false prophet either way. Muhammad did both when he delivered the Satanic Verses, which means you've got Muslims who say, we respect the prophets, we respect Moses more than you Christians. Okay, if Muhammad had delivered the Satanic Verses during the time of Moses, Moses would have said, everyone pick up a stone, grab a stone, this guy has to die. So how could we possibly accept him as a prophet when he would have been under a death sentence for delivering a false revelation and promoting polytheism? One more issue, and by the way, there are many more issues. For instance, it's a little side issue, but it's one of my favorite interesting little things. But the story of the Satanic Verses was about these bird intercessors. You got bird goddesses who will carry your prayers up to Allah and intercede for you. When you look at some of the issues that were going on in paganism, you see Muhammad is trying to replace paganism with an Islamic alternative. It's in the Hadith. Muhammad said that at the judgment, chapters of the Qur'an are going to appear as flocks of birds, and they're going to intercede for Muslims. So chapters of the Qur'an, Surah 2 is going to show up as a flock of birds. And the idea is that it's a flock because I guess individual birds are individual verses or something like that. But he said that flocks of birds are going to show up to intercede for Muslims. I mean, think about that. Why would chapters of the Quran appear as flocks of birds? Think about the mentality of the pagans. Allah is way up there. You need birds to carry prayers up there. And what's interesting is if you talk about the story of the Satanic Verses, any Muslim on the planet would recognize belief in the exalted cranes, Allat, Alus, and Manat, as total paganism. What? You've got these intercessors who are doing this work and so on, and they're conscious agents who are interceding for you and so on. You believe in these things and you're talking to them. Then you find out in later Islam, the chapters of the Quran are the exact same thing. They're your intercessors, and they're interceding with Allah for you. Well, it sounds like all you did was replace these goddesses with these chapters of the Quran, which do the exact same thing. And somehow that won't be paganism. So if you say it's a bird goddess who's carrying my prayers up to Allah or something like that, interceding for me, total paganism. If you could just call it Surat al-Baqarah doing it, that's totally fine. So Al-Usa, bad. Surat al-Baqarah, totally fine, doing the exact same thing. It's weird, weird system. But it looks like Muhammad's just taking the beliefs of the pagans and saying, here's the Islamic way of doing the exact same thing. But here, Muhammad, there's a verse of the Qur'an that was revealed in response to the Satanic Verses. So Muhammad was told by Gabriel, what are you doing? You delivered revelations from the devil. You fell for it. What's wrong with you? And Muhammad felt really, really bad, and he was totally miserable and depressed because he had fallen for this. And then Allah consoled him with Surah 22, verse 52, where he says, don't worry, Muhammad. We did not send before you any apostle or prophet. But when he desired, the shaitan, Satan, made a suggestion respecting his desire. But Allah annuls that which the shaitan cast. Then does Allah establish his communications, and Allah is knowing wise. Look at what he said. What's he say here? Don't worry, Muhammad. All prophets do this. All prophets, when they're receiving revelations, are duped by Satan, and Satan gives them some words, and then they think it's from God, but it's actually from Satan. But don't worry, because Allah comes back and fixes it later, and then he establishes what his real communications are. So in order to make Muhammad feel better, Allah has to tell him, don't worry, all prophets deliver revelations from the devil from time to time. This is a guy you want to trust. He's not just justifying his own blunder. He's now attributing the exact same blunder to all the prophets who came before him. So one big slap in the face to all prophets from a prophet who said that, hey, we respect all prophets in Islam. Oh, really? And yet they all fall for revelations from the devil? Anyway, that's where we'll be going in the very near future. Using the Satanic Verses, there are tons of ways. But again, the main issue here is Muhammad's promoting polytheism, which, by the way, what's the worst possible sin in Islam? Shirk. So Muhammad, keep in mind, Muhammad committed shirk. He convinced his followers to commit shirk. And he promoted shirk even among the pagans, because they all loved these verses about Allat, Alusa, and Manat. So you're telling me that the greatest prophet committed the worst possible sin and convinced his followers to commit the worst possible sin. Other minor issues there, by the way. I mean, think about this. Muhammad, he's teaching his followers Tawheed all these years. And then one day he comes out and says, hey, now we can pray to pagan goddesses, and they all bow down. Like, what? Hadn't you trained them? Hadn't you trained them to avoid polytheism? And all of a sudden you can step out and say, hey, let's all believe in pagan goddesses now. And they go, okay, that's weird. That's a weird community. But it shows they've been trained not to cling to some sort of pure monotheism, but to mindlessly accept anything Muhammad came up to them and said. And I'd say that sounds an awful lot like a cult. All right, I don't know what we're doing with time, but we take some questions now, or where's Elle? You're all mine now. Yeah, we'll just take some questions until Elle comes in and tells me to stop. Yes. He's a nerd with a nerd face, nerd glasses, nerd channel, nerd background. Hey, Elle's back. We're just talking about Mike Winger. How's it going?
Hey, Doc, off topic, I could totally take you in classic Greco-Roman wrestling. But on topic, just to add to the trifecta of your points, Deuteronomy 13 says that a prophet must be an Israelite as well. So he misses in that respect. But on topic, I wanted to ask you if you've heard of a gentleman who's recently come out within the last 6 months named Abdullah Hashem, who claims to be the Mahdi.
Oh, yeah.
So I haven't heard your take on it online. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that gentleman.
AP did a big live stream. I was traveling, but I was watching the live stream as he went through some clips of the guy and the guy's followers and so on. And this was a guy who used to study cults. He used to go around doing documentaries on cults and studying various cults. And all of a sudden, it seems like what he did was he spent years studying cults and doing programs on cults, learned everything, and then just said, let me combine all the cult tactics of all the cults into one big one, and I'll be the hero of it. Look, that looks like what he did. there are some people who are falling for it. They seem really weird. But no, the vast majority of Muslims are not falling for that guy. And there are people who came out of it who are like, this guy's a liar. He claimed that he healed me. In actuality, he sent me to a doctor, and then the doctor healed me, and then he went around claiming that he healed me and stuff like that. So there are people who are picking up on that. And of course, the main thing you're looking for in that is he's having sex with a bunch of the people in his cause. Usually a telltale sign. But yeah, so there are certain people you look like Muhammad. When I look at Muhammad, it's like, okay, I think he really thought he was a prophet, and he was just wrong. With that guy, I don't think he really even thinks he's a prophet. I think he's a guy who hears every single thing you can do to manipulate people into mindlessly following you, and I'm going to put all of it together into the ultimate cult. He's all the things from all the religions. I am all the things of all the religions. Like, okay. Yeah. He's a major dork. He's almost as bad as Mike Winger. I'm sorry.
I promise I won't ask about Mike Winger. No, so kind of on topic, kind of not, because part of what the Satanic Verses situation looks like is a matter of expediency, right? He couldn't get him to follow him, gives them something kind of that they like, and then the polytheists bow down before, it goes back and, well, now the devil made me do it. But my question is the counter to the counter. Everybody remembers Hadith, well, if you gave me the sun in the right hand, the moon in my left hand, I would never give up Islam. If you gave me all the riches, all the women, etc., I'm paraphrasing. So couldn't a Muslim counter and say, well, doesn't that speak to his integrity? If this religion was just about expediency, he could have had all of the things that the religion claims to be able to give him, and he gave that up to preach a religion. So wouldn't that speak to his integrity? Could that be a counter argument from the Muslim standpoint?
Partially. So when you're offering Muhammad's stuff, right, you're saying, hey, become a good pagan. We'll give you all this stuff. We'll give you women. We'll give you money. Anything you want. Just join us. There you could use the argument. But in this situation, it's kind of reversed. They're trying to get Muhammad to come to them. Muhammad was obsessed with getting his tribe. It was the most important thing in the world to him, was getting his tribe to agree with him, getting his uncle Abu Talib to agree with him. He was obsessed with his tribe converting to his religion. He eventually got his way. He eventually got his way when he conquered Mecca. And eventually it became convert or die, and they converted and so on. So this isn't just about giving Muhammad stuff. This is, he wants his tribe to accept Islam, and he wanted a revelation. He wanted a revelation that would help them do that. So this wasn't Muhammad getting money or women or something like that. It was, wow, now my tribe is on board. But again, if you wanted to say, well, this other thing Muhammad said means that this can't be historical, well, why not do the reverse? This is obviously historical. So Muhammad was obviously susceptible to his desires. And you can't say Muhammad's revelations weren't influenced by his desires. You have the famous hadith from Aisha when Muhammad kept getting these convenient revelations anytime he wants something. Oh, Allah says I can have 4 wives. Oh, I got a revelation saying I can have more. Muhammad swore an oath to stop having sex with his slave girl because his wives got mad that he was doing it in their beds. And then he comes back, Allah says I can break my oath and go. So he clearly is being influenced by his desires. Aisha noticed this, and that's when she said, your Lord hastens to satisfy your desires. So it's like, anytime you want something, you get a revelation. So we know that he was influenced by his desires. Straightforward, outright bribery. Hey, here's a pile of money to do this. Yeah, he might resist that. But as far as what he wants influencing his revelations, that fits perfectly into the pattern. And guess what? That's what the Satanic Verses is. It's he wants something and suddenly receives a revelation. But in this case was kind of too much for him.
All right, thank you.
How's it going, David? I've actually watched you for years, so good to get to talk to you. Came through Nabil like many did, and then so I've introduced to many others. But so when you're talking about these isnad chains, it seems like it's just one person saying if I'm understanding. Oh yeah, it was this guy said this guy this. So is it accurate to call them scribes, or is it truly just oral transmission supposedly? And also, why would they say it wasn't written down by one of these earlier people, and then all of a sudden, oh, this guy is the one that we have the record wrote it all down?
Yeah, most of the transmitters, especially early on, would have been oral transmission, and their explanations are like they wanted to keep these things distinct from the Qur'an. They didn't want to be writing things down and then people confuse it with the Qur'an and so on. So they transmitted things. Orally, and the main problem with that is this isnad. You get a story about Muhammad, and you're wondering, did someone make this up or is it authentic? And to rule out this story being made up, they say, aha, we've got the isnad chain. I got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so, got it from so-and-so. Well, the glaring problem is, if you can make up a story, you can make up a list of names.
Sure.
Right? And Muslims really think that, no, all this is verified, and you verified every person on this list and so on. But there are problems with the methodology. I mean, it's kind of circular. So, in other words, if you say, I don't trust this story, how can I know I can trust this story? Well, every person on this list is known to be reliable. Oh, really? How do you know that guy's reliable? You'd have to have a separate isnad chain going back and confirming some report about this guy being reliable. Okay, how do you know you trust those names on that list to give you that story about that guy? Oh, you need this other list of names telling you about those. Okay, you can never get started. You just have to kind of accept this list, all these stories about how these guys are reliable, and then apply that. And I don't know, it's just, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. So how do you know you trust these guys? We're going to have this other list. Well, how do you know you can trust? Well, you're going to have this other list. How are you going to trust? Well, you're going to have this other list. It can never get started. So you just have to, here's what my book says about all the guys I'm supposed to trust, and then go along with that. But yeah, if you're skeptical of that, it doesn't work. And that's why, that's one of the reasons, but it's one of the reasons Sheikh Al-Shirkati said this would not stand up to academic scrutiny. The general principle, if you can make up a story, you can make up a list of names.
Yeah. Are we going to get to hear from you as Ali Dawa at some point this weekend?
Oh yeah, and we'll be proud of that.
Absolutely. All right, nice. Thanks.
David, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Back home, we have several students from our church watching this live stream right now, and this is going to be a once-in-a-lifetime type thing where I would like to ask you a question, kind of like on their behalf or to help to equip them. And basically, we live in a very near a very high Muslim population, and a lot of our students were not raised around this at all, and all of a sudden in their schools, they're hearing the Dawah script, and this stuff is actually coming into our Protestant church. We're starting to hear these claims in our church, and it's actually through our students I kind of got pushed towards you. And one of the problems that I'm having is I'm trying to learn while trying to equip them with the tools they need, and there's so much to get into to fully get into the Islamic dilemma or the Satanic Verses. They need to learn quite a bit to get to that point. And I want to ask you, is that the best way to respond, especially if the goal is to win a soul, or is there a light? Is there an Islamic dilemma light that they could maybe take and use rather than learning everything? And also, I told them that I would shout them out. So, hey, City Session students, there you go.
Yep. Good question. And this doesn't just apply to those students. This applies to people in general. I've seen it as a issue, and I've talked about it in the past, but it's kind of an issue. You have lots of Christians who don't want to engage Muslims with discussions because they're worried that they don't know enough about Islam. I don't know anything about Islam, or I don't know enough about Islam, or I might talk to a Muslim and he might have 487 different objections, and he's going to stump me, and I'm going to be caught off guard, and I'm going to be humiliated, and so just rather not engage. I had absolutely no clue what I was talking about when I started talking to Muslims. And there are all sorts of issues you could bring up in Islam today that I wouldn't know about. I don't know why that would stop you. But I would encourage your students, if they haven't already, to become familiar with like Greg Kokel's tactics. It's about asking questions. And that's just helpful. One, you can use that method and not know anything about anything, right? You can not know anything about Islam and you just ask questions. You know, what do you believe about this? And the reason I like tactics was I found out after a while that I just kind of use something similar. And so I read that and I was like, it's not exactly the same, but he's doing something similar. Like when I thought years later, like how do I go about things if I want to tell people, I just realized that if I'm talking to someone for the first time, this is exactly what happened with Nabil. It's not, here's my methodology, I just kind of did it by nature. If we start off a discussion, I'd start asking what I call what questions, like, what do you believe about God? What do you believe about the Bible? What do you believe about Jesus? What do you believe about Muhammad? What do you believe about this? What do you believe about that? I'll just let the person tell me. And they can talk for hours. And this is telling me what this person believes. And eventually, I transition into why questions. So why do you believe that about God? Why do you believe that about Jesus? Why do you believe that about Muhammad? Why do you believe that about the Qur'an? And at that point, I have that particular person's reasons for believing something. Notice, nothing I did there has required the slightest bit of knowledge of what of anything at that point. But now I know something. I know what that person believes, and I know why that person believes it. And at that point, you can pick something. So I believe in Islam because of the perfect, miraculous preservation of the Quran. Well, suppose I know absolutely nothing about the Quran. You're talking about students in their area and stuff like that. Hey, I've never looked into that. Would you mind if I went and looked into that, and then I get back with you later and discuss that? So now you're not going out and learning everything. You're learning one issue. And so that's generally how I think people should be doing things if they're interacting with Muslims. And so you don't have any burden of proof in that situation on that topic because this is this person's claim. I'm going to go look into this, and then we'll get back together and discuss that a little more. And so you go and you do a little bit of studying on the history of the Quran. And then you go back and you just ask more questions. Hey, you said the Quran's been perfectly preserved. What about this passage in Sunan Ibn Majah in 1944 that says all these verses were eaten by Aisha's sheep and that we don't have them in the Quran anymore? What do you think about that? You don't even have to be mean. Just, hey, give me your perspective on this. And then come back later. Hey, you said perfect preservation of the Quran. I found this other passage from Abu Musa in Sahih Muslim. It says that 2 entire chapters of the Quran went missing because Muslims were too lazy to recite them. So how does that reconcile with your belief in the perfect preservation of the Quran? Give an explanation. You're getting information into the person's head that they will never in a million years hear from their imams and sheikhs. So they're told one thing. There's all this material in their sources that completely refutes what they're told. They're not going to hear that from their guys. They have to hear it from us. And so it's pretty easy to learn on the go, right? You learn as you're doing it. And then, so if you're talking to one person and that person gives you some reasons, you examine those reasons, and then you go back and all you had to learn was a response to one thing. You come back and give that one response to that one thing, and then pick something else and so on. But over time, you're talking to different Muslims and they're bringing up the exact same things, but now you're prepared for them. If someone ever stumps you and they bring up something you never heard before, there is zero shame in saying, I've never looked into that. Would you mind if I went and studied it? And keep in mind, they're not going to be, what an idiot, he doesn't know about this. They're going to be, wow, he actually wants to look into this. And they think you're going to go and find out that they're right. They think you're going to go study the history of the country because they never studied it. They were told that this is what the sources say. They were told perfect preservation or scientific miracles or something like that. They never looked into it. But you're actually going to go and look into it, and then you're going to come back. They think you're going to find out that what they said is true. You're going to come back with some further questions. They're going to have no clue how to answer. They're going to have to go back to their sheikhs and imams. Hey, what do we do about this verse, about verses of the Quran being eaten by a sheep? Their scholar will give them some answer, come back to you. You raise more objections and so on. So it's easier to go about it like that than thinking that you have to know everything ahead of time.
As you were reading through 2252 here, I thought of where he curses the young girl and says that I hope that you do not grow in your years, and he says that Allah turns the curses he gives into blessings. Do you think that was from the devil from him, and that Allah would annul it? And if so, do you think that is a quality of prophets?
No, it's pretty terrible. Muhammad's known for just cursing people on the drop of a dime. In fact, when we go through the Satanic Verses, there's a hadith, Jami at-Tirmidhi, where Muhammad says, knowledge is about to depart from my community. They go, what? One of the guys goes, what? What are you talking about? We've got the Quran. How can knowledge depart from us when we have the Quran? Muhammad says, may you be bereaved of your mother. It's like, wait, who talks to people like that? Muhammad did. So he would like say mean, nasty stuff to his followers, sometimes for defending Islam, and insult them and curse them. And then, hey, Muhammad, why are you cursing all these people? Well, don't worry. If I'm wrong, Allah will just flip it into a blessing. So I can just curse away and so on. But no, I don't think that's a good standard quality of prophets. Are we done, El? All right. Good.
Coming from an Arabic-speaking Christian believer. Check. What I'm trying to say is that what Islam really did is strip the deity from Jesus, stripped him, because you can't have cannot be incarnate in a man, right? And gave it to Muhammad. If you read between the lines, I know you do that. And as far as the Satanic Verses, I don't believe that just those verses in chapter 53. I think the verses from the first letter, Bismillah, to the last letter in the verse are the actual Satanic verses, denying Jesus' deity, denying the crucifixion, denying the salvation, denying who Jesus is and what he's done. That these are the Satanic verses, not just chapter 53 as far as I'm concerned. And not only that, the shirk that he committed, not just with that, he had Allah and all the angels, Inna Allah wa malaikatahu yusallun ala Muhammad. And every Muslim throughout the whole entire world, the trick is on, but they worship. And the verb is yusallun, meaning constantly, not that they did it in the past. Inna Allah wal malaikatahu yusallun ala Muhammad, meaning 24/7, Allah and all the angels in heaven have nothing to do but to pray on Muhammad. If that's not shirk, I don't know what is. That he even took God, he stripped God is nothing. God is absolutely nothing.
We call that a sock puppet.
Yeah,
Sock
exactly.
puppet. Mhm.
So, man ata'ani ata' Allah. He who obeyed me, obeyed God. He who loves me, God, you know what I'm saying? So he put himself, that's the actual shirk in Islam, not just those verses.
Even Surah 4, verse 65.
Yeah.
Surah 4, verse 65 says, a Muslim cannot be a true believer until he accepts all Muhammad's decisions, has no disagreement with any of them, and accepts them with full submission. So that's accepting everything Muhammad says with full submission. So think about this, prophet comes along and says, hey guys, this is a religion of pure monotheism. It's all about Allah. It's all about submission to Allah. You all want to submit to God, don't you? Okay, this is the religion of submission to God. Okay, how do we do that? Believe everything I say and submit to me. Okay, well, if anything sounds like shirk, it's that. But by the way, that issue of shirk, that's the reason early Muslims accepted this story and later Muslims rejected this story. The theology changed. In early Islam, they had a doctrine called Ismat al-Anbiya, which is Allah's protection of the prophets. Allah will protect a prophet. And in early Islam, the doctrine was Allah will protect a true prophet from persisting in any sort of major error. He's not going to allow a true prophet to persist in major error. He will, if a prophet commits major error, Allah will bring him out of it. It's exactly what you saw in Surah 22:52. They all do it from time to time, but then Allah brings them out of that. That was the doctrine in early Islam. Eventually, because they keep exalting Muhammad more and more, the doctrine of Allah's protection of the prophets changes from Allah will protect a prophet from persisting in error to Allah will protect a true prophet from committing any major error. Now notice, as far as the first view, the Satanic Verses story fits in perfectly. Muhammad committed shirk and Allah brought him out of it. Later, after the theology changes to Allah will protect a true prophet from committing any major error, Well, now you can't have the Satanic Verses because it would mean Muhammad's not a true prophet because Allah didn't protect him from committing the major error. And therefore, let's change the history. So here you have Islamic theology evolving over time, and they're using that to rewrite their history. And that is not a good system for getting us to trust in your prophet.
Rapid fire 30-second questions, final two.
I heard your sources on the screen. I was curious if there is a direct citation from maybe Ubay or Jalaluddin al-Suyuti for the Satanic Verses. I believe you said some of those people were students of Ubay, but I just didn't know if you had a direct quote from Ubay ibn Ka'b or Jalaluddin al-Suyuti.
No, we have some of the stuff from their students. We have things that go back to Ibn Abbas and some of the guys who are around there. But yeah.
Thank you.
Was Muhammad very familiar with these gods? In the interpretation of that verse 2252 by Ibn Kathir, the mushrikeen celebrated, rejoicing, Muhammad is coming back or came back to his early religion, the religion of his family. So he's not like being tricked by the devil. He's very familiar with it, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, I mean, so Muhammad grows up in an environment where you've got Allah, and lots of people believe that Allah is like part of the pagan pantheon. A lot of them viewed Allah as like the main god, and there's all these subordinate deities and so on. So yeah, you could totally view Muhammad as just sort of coming back home for a little bit.
So he was a mushrik for 25, 30 years, and somehow Allah forgave him for that unforgivable sin?
Yeah, and that's the thing. So you have all these verses in the Quran which say Allah doesn't forgive this one thing, but he obviously does because they were all pagans back then. And so they reconcile that by saying, you know, if you do it after you have the knowledge, then you commit shirk, well, then you're in real trouble and Allah's not going to forgive you. Well, you better reject this story then. You better reject this story because this is after Muhammad is a prophet and he's been preaching Islam for years, and all of a sudden, hey, let's pray to these pagan goddesses. That would be the shirk of the unforgivable sort. By the way, there's like a million directions you can go with this, but I mean, think of the core little issue. Muhammad couldn't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan. According to the Quran, no one can imitate the Quran. No one can imitate it. Well, Satan imitated it and even convinced Muhammad and all of his companions. How are you going to tell me no one can imitate the Quran? It doesn't make any sense, even according to your sources.
Thank you so much, Dr. David Wood. Most people do not have any clue how important that is, so I'm really glad they get to hear it from you. I mean, you are like by far the all-time nerdiest alter ego of Mike Wenger, so it's such a blessing to get to hear it from you.